Tresli Bessi Nebagan Laila, Frushkarabalabas Sakit up, the Besli Bessi, Prushkarabalabas Fashkiti Bim. Chitikitila Bibila Bibili Bitsikudi Sakabam Fishki the Bish. Mumala Bambo, Chitikitili Bitakit up. Tresli Bessi Nebagan Grugi, Blaula Fiola Bimini Bish. Fiola Bimini, Fushkarabalabas Tikit up. Tresli Bessi Nebagan Laila, Frushkarabalabas Tikit up, the Betsli Bessi, Prushkarabalabas Fashkiti Bim. Chitikitila Bibili Bitsikudi Sakabam Fishki the Bish. Zitikitili bitakit top. Tresli besina megan grügi. Bla la viola bimini bish. Viola bimini. Fush karabalwas. Zikiti top. Zik zap zik. Fush. Fush karabalwas. Fush karabalwas. Fush karabalwas. Zig zag. Fush karabalwas. Tik. Nebagan. Nebagan. Fish. Nebagan Laila. Tresli Bessi Nebagan Laila, Pushkarabalwas, Sakit up, the Bessi, Pushkarabalwas, Fashkidi Bim, Citikitila Billy Bitsiklu, Sakabam, Fishkidi Bish, Mumbala Bambo, Citikitili Bitakit up, Tresli Bessi Nebagan Grugi, Bla Fiola Bimini Bish, Fiola Bimini, Pushkarabalwas, Tikiti, Sup. That was, thank you. One of the 6 sound poems of Hugo Ball that he wrote in 1916 and presented at one of the soirees of the Dada movement that was started in 1916 at the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich, Switzerland. I discovered this poem at a workshop back in 1977. I had quit my studies of mathematics and was looking for other things to do and things to develop, and I was playing saxophone at the time and writing some poetry, like in normal, regular poetry in Dutch. But then I happened to be in a workshop about reciting poetry, and well, they were offering some more regular traditional material, but also more experimental, and some sound poems. So I felt really very much attracted to those, and I memorized this little poem by Hugo Ball and presented it at the presentation, recited it at the presentation of the workshop. So I didn't know at that time, this was very intuitive, sort of an eye-opener, and later on I realized that this was an opening into a very interesting field between music on the one hand and literature or poetry on the other hand, sort of a no man's land with a lot of freedom to develop new things and without being obstructed by rules as in music or as in traditional poetry. So I went on with that. And on the other hand, as you of course noticed, I improvised a little bit with the poem, with the material. So that's the other side that my work comes from, at least at the beginning, from the free improvisation, free jazz that I was trying to do on the saxophone. I'd like to show a few more examples of early sound poetry. This is even earlier than the Dada movement. Paul Scherbart was a German poet who published some nonsense poems in a volume of otherwise poems in German. And this is one of those, Kikakoku e Koralaps. And a contemporary of his was Christian Morgenstern. Also some nonsense poems in a volume of otherwise German poems, Das große Lalula, or the great Lalula, with the repeated line Lalu, 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 Lalula. This is actually became the most famous poem of Morgenstern, a classic of experimental poetry, where well, there are various possibilities to make this into sound. Could maybe any of you have a suggestion how to sound this poem? Yeah? Yeah, go ahead. Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, that sounds like this interpretation as a graphic score with help notes and some glissandi. There, and as I didn't mention yet, the title is Fisch's Nachtgesang, or Night Song of the Fish. So that makes my favorite interpretation of it is like the closing and opening of the mouth of a fish, like. And so on. Yeah. Another one by Hugo Ball, Gaji Bimba, of a sort of Oriental inspiration. Another one by Hugo Ball, Caravane, or Caravan, where I imagine that it could be the calls of the camel drivers in the desert. Hey, Gigagoramen, Higo, Bloiko, Rusula, Huyu, Holaga, Holala, hey, Tatagorem, hey, Tatagorem, and so on. That's also one of my favorites. Then here's one by Raoul Hausmann, who was a member of the Berlin Dada group. This is from 1919. He made a few of poster poems. These are large format posters. And he suggested that the size of the letters should be a measure for the loudness, for the dynamics. So it could be something like K, P, E, R, I, O, U, M, P, E, R, I, O, U, M. R, I, P, E, R, and so on. Actually, this came about because he had access to a print shop where he could use the letters that were worn out or damaged and were thrown away. So that's why he ended up with having all the different fonts and sizes mixed up. But this led to a sort of a new score for sound poetry. This is an example by Theo van Doesburg, founder of the art movement De Stijl, from 1921, which he published under a pseudonym I.K. Bonset, which is actually almost the Dutch phrase ik ben zot, or I am crazy. So letter, klankbeelden, letter, sound images, with elaborate instructions on how to perform this. And then here's one of the most extreme Dada poems. The word brüllt in German means to scream or to roar, the verb. And these are 410 times lined up. It's by Tristan Tzara, also from 1919. And I made a recording of it for my first solo sound poetry CD, where I start relatively relaxed. Brüllt, brüllt, and then towards the middle, something like brüllt, brüllt, and at the very end, something like that. So it takes about 9 minutes, the recording, and I don't very often perform it live, I must say. And at the very end, Tzara writes this one line, der sich immer noch sehr sympathisch findet, who still finds himself a very nice guy. And then this is a similar example by Man Ray, the American filmmaker and photographer, and when he was in Paris in 1924, he made this, and when I saw this first, it gave me the impression of a very brutal, rude act of censorship, like crossing out a whole poem with a thick marker. So I thought it deserved also a regressive sound to perform, so I recorded it as ah, 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 and so on. The whole poem, the sounds, the duration of the sound proportional to the strokes. And this is actually on also on a CD I made, and which is out of print now. But both this and the previous one you can download through my website. And some people have found them useful when they had visitors and wanted them to go away. There's something to play. Then, at some point, a little later on, I found the classic of early sound poetry, the so-called Ursonate, or sonata in primitive or primordial sound by Kurt Schwitters, which John already mentioned. And I made photocopies of the whole piece. It's about 30 pages of invented sounds, with a structure like a sonata, a classical sonata or symphony in 4 movements. First movement followed by a largo, a scherzo, largo, scherzo, and presto with a cadenza where the soloist can improvise. And I had no idea yet at the time that I could be such a thing as a vocal performer. I was still playing saxophone and had started to compose music, mainly jazz tunes. And all the while I was taking out this piece and working on and practicing certain passages of it. And until after 2.5, 3 years, I had it almost memorized, and I had mentioned it to some friends, and one friend asked me to perform it at his birthday party, and I did that, and people liked it, and I was asked to perform it in a neighborhood bar, and so it went on. And actually, before I like to present the first movement as an example of how with nonsense sounds you can still make a really tightly structured piece. And because the first movement is built on 4 main themes, it's very good if you know these 4 main themes, and then you can recognize them when they occur, and also see that the whole piece is built out of the syllables of those 4 main themes by rearranging them and going backwards and repeating them and so on. So in order to learn these 4 main themes, we will have a little rehearsal now. So I will do them, and you just repeat after me, so you have them in your ears better when I perform, okay? Here we go. The first one. Fums bovetet se u. Pagif quie. Okay, now the whole thing. Fums bovetet se u. Pagif quie. Great. We go to number 2. Dedesen r I e. Een piftilf to. Til yuka. I'm sure you can master the whole thing. Listen closely. Dedesen r I e. Een piftilf to. Til yuka. Okay. Well, at one occasion I was invited to a conservatory in Strasbourg, France, to hold a talk about sound poetry for the professors. And the one who had invited me already warned me beforehand that his colleagues, some of his colleagues were talking about sound poetry as something that their 2-year-old daughter can do better. So what I did at the beginning of the talk, I wrote the 4 main themes on the blackboard and told the professors, you have 10 minutes to memorize them, and then you have to present them to your colleagues. So at the end of the 10 minutes, I wiped them out and gave them a bit of a hard time. So we go to number 3. Rinsekete baby in skermu. Ziu ense ziu rinskermu. Rakte baby. Okay, we'll keep it easy from now on. Number 4, rumpftilfto. Great. So those are the 4 main themes, and they come back several times, and you hear the syllables floating around and being changed and so on. So I'll now perform the first movement of the sonata. Fims bovetet se u bagif kuye. Dil beba. Bebe fumsba, bebe fumsba, bebe fumsba vate, befumsba vatetse, fumsba vatetse u, fumsba vatetse u, bagif kwie. Dat is een I1 piftil zo til juka. Rinske de baby in skermu, zie wanneer die in skermu, raket de baby, rumpftilfto. Zie wanneer in skermu, zie wanneer die in skermu, raket de baby, raket de baby. Fums, wat dat zei u, OCTWB, fums. Raketarin, 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 beba, baba, fums, baba, fums, baba, baba, te, fums, baba, te, baba, te, fums, baba, te, baba, te, u, fums, baba, te, u, baba, te, pa, fums, baba, te, pa, baba, te, baga, fums, te, baga, baba, te, bagif, fums, baba, te, bagif. Raketarin, 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 beba, baba, fums, baba, fums, baba, baba, fums, baba, baba, fums, baba, te, baba, fums, baba, te, baba, te, zeba, fums, baba, te, baba, te, uba, fums, baba, te, uba, baba, te, baga, fums, baba, te, baga, baba, te, bagif, fums, te, bagif. Raketarin, 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 ba, 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 baba, 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 bavara, 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 Fims without your bagif, 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 fims without your bagif. Dit is een I en piftil til. Dit is een dit is een een pa, een puf, een pif, een pifte, een piftil, een piftil, een piftilfto. Dit is een I1 piftilfto. Dit is een I1 piftilfto til. Dit is een I1 piftilfto til. Juka. Fums wordt zei o bagif. Dit is een I1 piftilfto til. Juka. Rinsekete baby in skermu, dio en dio rinskermu, rakete baby, sikete baby, rinsekete baby, rakete baby, sikete baby enta, rinsekete baby enta, rakete baby enta, sikete baby in skr, rinsekete baby in skr, rakete baby in skr, sikete baby in skermu, rinsekete baby in skermu, rakete baby in skermu, sikete baby in skermu, dio en dio rinskermu, rinsekete baby in skermu, dio en dio rinskermu, rakete baby in skermu, dio en dio rinskermu, rakete baby, rumptilfto, dio en dio skermu, dio en dio rinskermu, rakete baby, rakete baby. Fims voor dat zei o bagif. Dat is een I1 piftilfto til juka. Rinske de baby in skermu, die jongens die in skermu, raket de baby. Rumpftilfto. Rump. 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 Rumpel. Rump. Rumptilf. Rump. Rumpftilfto. Rumpftilfto ziu. Rumptilfto, Ziuense. Rumptilfto, Ziuense, Diuenskermu. Rumptilfto, Ziuense, Diuenskermu, Ziuense, Diuenskermu. Rumptilfto, Ziuense, Diuenskermu, Ziuense, Diuenskermu. Rak de baby. Rumptilfto, Ziuense, Diuenskermu, Ziuense, Diuenskermu. Rak de baby, rak de baby. Fums, hvor det ser jo begif. Det er sådan, I en piftilfto til jøka. Rinske til babyen skrømø, Ziuense, Diuenskermu, rak de baby. Rumptilfto. Rum. Rumf. Rum. Rumftil. Rum. Rumftilf. Rum. Rumftilfto. Rum. Rumftilfto, Ziu. Rum. Rumftilfto, Ziuense, Ziu. Rum. Rumptilfto, Ziuense, Diuenskermu. Rum. Rumptilfto, Ziuense, Diuenskermu, Ziuense, Diuenskermu. Rum. Rumptilfto, Ziuense, Diuenskermu, Ziuense, Diuenskermu, rak de baby. Rum. Fums, hvor det ser jo begge. Det er sådan, I en piftilfto til jøka. Rinske til babyen skrømø, Ziuense, Diuenskermu, rak de baby. Rumptilfto. Ziuense, Diuenskermu, Ziuense, Diuenskermu, rak de baby, rak de baby. Fums, hvor det ser jo, TTVB, 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 TTVB. Fums. Fums, ba! Fums, ba! Fums, hvor det Fums, ba! Fums, ba! Fums, hvor det ser jo, rinske til babyen skrømø. Fums, ba! Fums, ba! Fums, hvor det Sutter Sonata. Thank you. So now you must imagine this is about 1/3 or 1/4 of the whole piece. The whole thing lasts about half an hour. And it was like in the early 80s that I got invitations to perform it, for instance, in at punk rock clubs, where as opening for punk bands, and so where people came to listen to their favorite band or to chat with their friends and have a beer, not to listen to this kind of nonsense. So it wasn't all too popular always. So and they ended up throwing the beer at me, and. The culminating point was this when I once opened for the Stranglers at a big concert hall in Holland, and I already before I had started, when I was being announced, they already screamed "Rot up, rot up!" Fuck off, fuck off, and then I started. It was like a football game, but definitely an away game. So. And there were 6 stage guards keeping people from climbing on stage and to attack me. And but of course I had a good PA system and I could be louder than all them together. So I managed to win over maybe a couple hundred of the 2,000 to my side. The nice thing was that one national newspaper wrote a headline next day: Jaap Blonk shocks punk audience with Dada poetry. So that was kind of nice. So at the point I got more and more performances with this piece and with some other Dada poetry. At the same time, I was still working on the saxophone and trying to get, like you do in free improvisation, all the possible sounds out of the instrument. But I never was entirely happy with what I could do on the horn. And all of a sudden, at some point, I had moved to Amsterdam. I was sitting in my attic room, listening to an old free jazz record by Archie Shepp and Roswell Rudd. Archie Shepp, tenor saxophone, and Roswell Rudd on trombone was playing as well. And they were in a heavy duet or duel, the two horns. And I found myself going along with that. Some improvising, emulating the music that I was hearing, and then at some point I found myself still doing it when the record had long ended and spinning in a groove. So it felt kind of good. I had no idea that it could mean anything artistically or musically, but fortunately at the time, like the whole 1980s. And a little later still, there was a really vibrant and thriving scene in Amsterdam of improvisers, musicians, but also dancers. And they would get together in small venues and do informal performances, all improvised. And I could take part in those, and so develop my abilities as a vocal improviser together with excellent musicians and dancers. So that was fortunate. Then at some point, people started to ask me, "Hey, Jaap, you're now doing performances of these old Dada sound poems and so, but when will you come up with some sound poems of your own?" And this was kind of difficult for me at the beginning, and sort of I was sort of intimidated by the work of Schwitters, which is really a masterpiece, and I had defended it in difficult circumstances because I felt this is a masterpiece, I have to defend it, there was a holy fire, and so how could I come up with something of my own against such a piece? So the first pieces that I created were very simple and short pieces, something like, for instance, this one came up in the mid-80s. This is entitled, I gave this the title Electroshock Boogie. And it actually originated when I was improvising with a contrabass player who was at the time really vehemently scraping on a low string, and I sort of copied his movement and made a sound that went well together with it. And we usually rehearsed in a music school with a big window, and the kids were outside and watching us, and they had nicknamed me Mr. Electric Boogie, which was the dance coming up in the mid-'80s, the hip-hop thing, because of the way I moved, I think. So that's how I came to the title Electroshock Boogie. And, well, another method was related to surrealism, concrete poetry as well. The objet trouvé, found object. You find something and try to do something with it. I found this headline or this line in a Dutch newspaper, de minister-beteur dergelijke uitlatingen, and later on I translated it into different languages, and I'll try to do a British version. The Prime Minister finds such utterances utterly inappropriate. 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 I shortened this a little bit. You have the original is here. Well, extremely instead of utterly, but okay. So you see the mechanism, very mechanical operation, but it leads to some surprising expression. And as you may already have thought of, there's a mirrored version like this, which actually leads to a completely opposite emotion. And I can do it at the end of this talk. If somebody has a request, I will perform the Prime Minister 2 for you. This is a Spanish version, somewhat simpler. And then this is a sound poem, one of my early sound poems, dedicated to the French surrealist poet and theater pioneer Antonin Artaud, who was very important for me by performing some of his texts that really are about madness. I found more freedom on stage to go further towards extreme things, and this is sort of inspired by the fact that he was put away in mental health clinics for about 10 years. And among other things, he wrote much stuff of genius there, which has been published only after his death. He died in 1948 in, I think, 27 volumes at Gallimard in Paris. And but everywhere in his French writings, there are fragments of phonetic poetry, sound poetry, sounding French, but with no meaning. And it's reported that he used to recite these sound poetry fragments in his cell in the institution for hours on end, and accompanying himself on little drums. This piece is also composed out of nonsense words, but sounding French, and using the fact that the word accent in French is usually on the last syllable of the word. So the first 3 lines go like Pêche qui trame du pabo c'est un pi ou tant sur jamais quand j'ai qu'au but en conclusion j'ai avantage un peu au crime d'aragusipé. To get a nice irregular rhythm. I also arranged it for one of my bands, and which I had introduced my text, my sound poetry text in the music, and we improvised on that using the irregular rhythm patterns, and try to speed it up until really the frenzy that Artaud was evocating. So the same 3 lines again, but a little faster. Then there's this middle part where I've always been fascinated by the timbre possibilities of consonants. And here you see a text that has suggests the consonants to be very long and the vowels just very short, as opposed to regular singing where the vowels are long, drawn out, and consonants are just stepping stones in between them. So every consonant here is a sort of a little area, an island, where I can explore the timbre possibilities of that particular consonant and then just almost skip the vowel in between. So to go into the details of those consonants and trying to make the most of it by variation. And in the bottom you'll find the same 3 lines at the top, but very much distorted to give suggestions for improvisation with it. One more example of a sound poem I did using the normal Latin Roman alphabet. This is in fake Dutch, but actually inspired by the early bebop from the 1940s, like Oobop Shabam, this is Gillespie, Parker, and so. And it also has the structure of many bebop songs, that A-A-B-A form. You see the A repeated and then a B part and then the A comes back again. I will perform this and then crossfade in a version I recorded with my early experimental jazz band. So you have an example of how I did incorporate sound poetry in the music. Oblabum bam bam boom, leblabum bed la da la, oblabum boom bam bam. Oblabum bam bam boom, leblabum bed la da la, oblabum boom bam bam. Bella bella ulululu, the amount of bum bum, the amount of bim bim, the amount of mumble. Tim tam tam. Oh, dub dub. Oblabum bam bam boom, level bum bed la da la, the pot of oblabum boom bam 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 bam. Now is the theme again. Oblabum bam bim boom. Leblabum bed la da da da. Oblabum boom bam bam. Oblabum bam bim boom. Leblabum bed la da da da. Oblabum boom bam bam. Bella bella ululu. The mathemata boom bam bam. The mathemata mem bim bim. The mathemata mum bim. Tim tam tam. Oh, debba dum. Debba dum.
boo, ah. Dabba 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 dum. Ja 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 ja. Abla boom bam boom. Lebla boom bed la 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 la. Abla bam boom bam bam bam.
Thank you. Now, these were two examples of sound poems, as I said, written in the normal Roman alphabet. But very soon I found that too much of a constraint. So, I wanted to have a, so to say, a richer palette of sounds. I decided to study phonetics a little bit, learn the International Phonetic Alphabet, like you find it in dictionaries, to give the pronunciation of words in a language that you don't know. These are a few lines I wrote in the International Phonetic Alphabet. The first one would go, Agadabu, Peyong, Ring. So you see that there are different letters, some from Greek, some others, and also a lot of different signs on top or below the letters. For instance, this thing under the U means a creaky voice. And there's a sign, this inverted C is actually the O, but the sign on top of it, the tilde, means that it should be nasal. And then there's these little things. The inverted E is sort of the neutral vowel, the schwa, something like that. But then the thing on top of it says that it should be very short, almost not a syllable. Agrebu, agrebu, like that. Whereas these vertical strokes below the M's mean that they should be separate syllables, so it wouldn't read up, but up, and then it goes on, where the capital M is one of the first symbols I added to the phonetic alphabet, because as soon as I learned it, I found that many of the sounds I made in improvisation, or sounds I like to make, were not represented in it. So I started adding my own symbols to it. And so the capital M for the kissing sound, and this inverted P for a more dry sound. So that line would go, hap, habu, padiwai, oh, hap, habu, padiwai, oh, something like that. So there's a lot of different possibilities there, and still to transcribe something it was really hard. This is actually a little sound poem entitled Just a Thought, and not written from scratch, but a transcription from a short improvisation of about 30 seconds that I recorded on a cassette tape and then sat down to transcribe it into the International Phonetic Alphabet. It took me about 3 hours. And then about a year later, I took out this notation and recorded it again without having listened to the original recording, and it turned out quite different. So actually that made me happy, because it showed that even a meticulous notation cannot capture the freedom of the human voice, and so there's always a lot of freedom. Then there was actually too much freedom for me to write. I got into a terrible writer's block. There were so many possibilities with these several hundred symbols of the phonetic alphabet and no meaning to help me. So I decided to concentrate on a few letters, or just one letter, or a small group of letters, or phonemes, to make a study of it. And this was the first one. It's about the R. The R is one of the most fascinating letters of the alphabet, because it has so many different pronunciations. They have the tongue tip, or the throat, and the dark English, some English forms of English, or the North American called retroflex, because the tip of the tongue tends to be bent backwards against the palate. So, and there are other possibilities that I discovered doing this, the research for this piece. Um, I, I still perform it and sometimes discover new possibilities. It has a lot of freedom. I can move from any box to any other one or come back and skip a lot of them or some of them and stay in one box longer or shorter. And usually I begin here. There are arrows drawn in between the different boxes, but they give the course I took on a specific recording for my first solo CD, so that listeners could try to follow the score while listening to the piece. And this is tongue tip R unvoiced. That's indicated by the O or 0 below it. And the double dots may give that it must be prolonged. And here, this black dot means that it should be with a lot of pressure, something like that. And at the early stage, I still indicated descriptions of some of the sounds to help me what it should sound like. So here it says in Dutch, a grasmaaier or a lawn mower, but then old-fashioned one, not motorized, but one that you have to push, like to indicate the sound that it should be. As for instance, here is written lichte motorfiets, light motorcycle, where it is a throat R, a uvula trill, going up and down in frequency. And so on. Here you have arrows to the left, which I started to use for inhaling sounds. And then there's a slight movement of the tongue against the palate from r to r, and then inhaling the sound. Here you have an example of the one tap R that you find, for instance, in Spanish in the word perro with one R, as opposed to perro with double R, which there is really an R, but this is just perro with almost a D, a little different from that. But then going forward out, exhaling, and then back inhaling with high multiphonics, something like that. So on. This led also to the useful discovery that there are ways to make to vocalize without having to stop for breathing, just going on and on. And here you have a voiced R. What more do we have? For instance, here this is a retroflex R, but with a lot of pressure on it, so it creates sort of a parallel band of frequencies going down, up and down together like this. So there are a few possibilities of the R. While doing the research for this piece, I was it was very interesting that many instructions in the International Phonetic Alphabet are not in terms of sound, but in terms of the mechanics of the mouth, because the sounds that you're supposed to make, you don't know them beforehand. So these instructions in terms of how the lips should be formed, where the tongue should be, how much air pressure, and so on, they are very useful. And I started to experiment with those. So the mechanics were the primary thing instead of the sound. And I would try things out and then find or stumble upon sounds that I wouldn't otherwise have discovered. For instance, I would start with a tongue tip R like this, and then move the tongue to the front, outwards, gradually. find some simultaneous vibrations of the tongue and the lips, which could then interact and in unexpected ways, or moving the tongue backwards from the same position. To find an aggregate vibration of the tongue and the soft palate and the uvula. And then from the same position I tried to inhale, and nothing at first would happen, but then I found this, and then I worked a little bit on it, and I could isolate one flap of that. So I found an interesting percussive sound that I could use in improvisations or in pieces, which I couldn't have imagined before, but I got to that by experimenting with the mechanics of the mouth. So that was a useful thing. I'll go to the second phonetic etude that I made was frictional, because it deals with the sounds that are caused by friction of air, the unvoiced fricatives or hissing sounds, and they are treated systematically from the front of the mouth, the two lips, going all the way back until at the end they are at the vocal cords, without getting them to vibrate, just the air escaping without resistance between them. So it goes like and now we're here. So I worked with that, and then within the red rectangle there are manual manipulations added to the sound to give them a rhythm and to alter them in ways that you could not do without your hands or fingers. For instance, with the F. Or with the sh. Or with a. And so on. So, and here again, you notice that you can make the sounds inhaling as well as exhaling. So I could make this piece into a non-stop vocal performance, a sort of perpetuum mobile, going on with this same rhythm, but with different underlying sounds and sound manipulations. A different version of the same piece, where in the middle part on the left and right side there are just a straight phonetic alphabet symbols, but in between there are all kinds of signs I made, which I like to do to suggest certain possibilities, and not only of voice sounds, but sometimes also of movement. So signs that don't have any specific meaning, but that suggests creativity and finding new sound possibilities or new performance possibilities. And this is an early study about the lip sounds, where, for instance, here you see the attempt to prolong a B leads to sort of vibration of the lips, whereas with a P you get a much faster vibration of the lips because the pressure is higher. And so I indicated that with this kind of waveforms. And then also with other letters here, there's an R superposed on it. Or here there's a throat R on top of it. And here there's so all different kinds of sound characters, where I already at this time I had started to experiment also with electronic sound. So I was getting more interested in timbres that you could slightly vary, as opposed to, well, as a sound poetry performer, I was used to be very active on stage, like keeping the audience engaged for every second of the performance. But then the activity with electronics, when you're sitting in the studio with the recording, is very different. You can just slightly turn a knob, slowly push a fader, and some of those methods came back into my own performance as well. And I'm about to demonstrate a little bit of that here. You see an early drawing of the idea of stereo possibilities of the mouth, of the two corners of the mouth. And during many years I worked on that and developed it into a separate technique, which I now call the cheek synthesizer. And I'll do a little solo on the cheek synthesizer for you now. And that's why we have here this contraption. It's a little too loud? Okay. Boom. Yeah. So, okay. Thank you. So this is a later version of the same piece where the red sort of little hands are drawn in to indicate that there should be some manipulation with the hands. Although I never managed to find a more exact notation, it just have to be by hand. Another etude about the so-called approximants, where you see in the top and bottom row some studies for tongue positions. Some I have not yet managed to do. This is quite a different piece, using only 2 letters of the Russian, of the Cyrillic alphabet. The three-leg thing in the beginning means sh, and the other ones stand for tsh. This is called Trans-Siberian. It's a triptych about the Trans-Siberian Express, famous train from Moscow to Vladivostok. And this is sort of the beginning. And then the train at full speed. And so something like that. And then the ending where it stops in the east. Well, this piece, you should imagine it's a score on a square piece of cardboard, where you have to, so as you see, you have to turn the board in order to be able to read on. So, but this gives an image that goes well with the sounds. So I start like. And so on. And I also I used this to for a piece for my ensemble, where I wrote notations for all the musicians, partly traditional notes, partly instructions or graphic scores, and they had to go to the next section when I turned my score. So turning the score was a sign for them to go to their next section, and I'll play a little bit of that. And then the empty square, which is just silence. And one more example, how I worked with the images or signs in the music is this. where actually it happened that the phonetic signs sort of didn't obey me anymore and started making faces at me. So this is a whole page with different facial expressions, where I had the idea to cut these into separate squares, separate faces, and give them to the musicians of my ensemble, distribute them in a different way at every concert, and having groups out of the ensemble, which was then a 13-piece group, to play sounds that were suggested by the particular face that I got for that piece on that particular night. So, we made a series of very short pieces, varying from like 10 to 15 seconds or a little longer, and then so I play a few of these, call them reporters because they were portraits and made into different portraits in music. Scores, it gradually developed them into independent visual work, but I'll stay with sound now and move to a different project I did, which was making a CD of minimal techno music but with only vocal sounds that I, without processing them electronically in any way, and I'll play a little bit of one piece of that. I think you noticed that many of the short sounds don't sound very human anymore. That is because they are cut very cleanly, and so the transients have been taken off, and that is the element that makes them human. So at first for this project I started to just record a few improvisations and searching through them for little sounds that I could use, but then I noticed that to make a sort of convincing techno sound, you need a more structured approach. So I found 3 sounds basically that were good for a kick drum. The one I just demonstrated earlier, or the one with the 2 lips recorded very close mic, and one recorded here. So those 3 sounds, and then all kinds of sounds for the snare drum and assorted percussion and bass sounds. For instance, in this piece, it's something like a combination of a growl from the throat with a vibration of the lips, or inhaling sounds where you can get really deep. Something like that. So that's how we managed to make this without doing any processing after the fact. You could of course say that recording very close to a mic is a strong has a strong EQing effect because it gives much more bass, and also how loud you record and so on. So you could already say that's electronic processing, but there's no pitch shift or anything else done with it. I think I want to talk a little bit about another project I did, which is entitled Traces of Speech. I have it here, where I would make drawings, collage-like drawings like this one, and then feed them into character recognition software that they use to digitize printed texts. And of course it couldn't make any sense of them, so you get really long nonsense text with all kinds of punctuation marks and dollar signs, and so I have a few examples here, something like that, or that. So I tried my best to record those and find various ways to perform those on a CD, and I have one example where I left it to computer voices. That is here, where you first hear, this is a bilingual project. It was Traces of Speech, Sprachspuren, also German. So you start hearing a German voice and then it crossfades into the English computer voice.
IVV, V, Unterstrich, einfaches Anführungszeichen unten, V1, V.1, einfaches Anführungszeichen unten FT, Bindestrich, Bindestrich, kleiner als D, Schrägstrich, V.5, einfaches Anführungszeichen unten, VK, 2 Doppelpunkt 1, einfaches Anführungszeichen links VVV, einfaches Anführungszeichen unten, kleiner als V, Bindestrich, 51V, VSE, ZW Unterstrich, Schrägstrich, VVV, minus 3, KK, einfaches Anführungszeichen links, P, VVV, Schrägstrich, einfaches Anführungszeichen unten, V, einfaches Anführungszeichen unten, VV, einfaches Anführungszeichen unten, Unterstrich, V, CW, Slash, 1, einfaches Anführungszeichen, slash, dash, K, slash 1, underscore, minus 5, N, L, minus $1, dash, single quote K, dash, dash 1, X slash dove, underscore tilde, underscore, slash, underscore, DK, or underscore slash, E1, underscore, single quote 3, underscore, dash, underscore, backslash, underscore, slash, less than, 4, backslash, tilde, underscore, slash, 2V, tilde, 1, 4, underscore, 4E dash, L, 3 slash tilde, X, 3 dash 2, tilde, dash, X, dash, underscore I, underscore slash E, WI dash slash, X, slash K, K backslash.
So, and the electronic sounds you hear were actually made by importing the same drawings into audio software, where you get strange electronic sounds, which I then processed and composed with algorithmically. So in this next fragment that I will play, and but giving also really interesting results. Here it is combined with a very quiet recitation of the text in German and English at the same time.
3G.1 V57K $4 greater than £2 kleiner als L, größer als 455, 5 VL, 7 zu 5, 1 E, 1 73, 5, I, 4, 3.
Okay, and I will briefly mention one more project I did before giving you the opportunity to ask questions, which is this is Triangle Stories, where a series of pieces for ensembles, small or big. I perform them with ensembles of vocalists as well as with instrumentalists. The idea is that when playing such a piece, there are these triangles with different colors, and the players can wander around the score and repeat certain elements or skip certain elements. There's a lot of freedom, but every color should correspond. They should choose upon first playing that a certain sound timbre, and then when they come back to the same triangle, use that same timbre and have a different one, in this case for the green and the brown and the purple. Then there are some words, nonsense words that can be used, and then there are numbers in some triangles. Here's a 4 and a 2, and they mean that they should improvise, for instance, in phrases of 4 sounds, which can be short or long. So an improvisation could be like so I have the experience that giving such a restriction, a constraint, can lead to very interesting results. Makes it more cerebral, but also gets it to certain extremes sometimes. And then there's one other element. There are these idiosyncratic signs in some places that when a performer plays that sign the first time, should find a rather complex sound that that sign represents for her or him. For instance, it could be something like that. But then when you play it the second time, you should exactly remember that sound. Play it the same way when you get to that sign again. Some other examples where here there are bigger and smaller triangles of the same color, and the size, the colors represent timbre, and the size represents the dynamics, the volume of a certain sound. And here there are more numbers, and okay. But they get more complex along the way. So yeah, I think I should stop here and give you the opportunity for questions, if that's okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Hang on. Go. Thanks. Yeah, that was brilliant. I'm exhausted listening to you. Okay.
Lots of writers and artists theorize and present ideas about the origins of music, especially vocal expression, none of which I find credible. And given that your practice exists between quite a studied approach to the anatomy of the mouth and actually producing nonsense sounds, do you have any thoughts on why people feel the urge to broadcast themselves in ways other than talking?
Oh, that's of course probably very individual. For me, it has been very liberating, and also, there's another side that also audience, spectators, listeners have commented on that it was liberating for them because they were not forced by the meaning of the words in a specific direction, and it gives a lot of freedom of associations. One very nice example I experienced was when I did for over the several years a project in primary schools where the children, where I performed a sound poem about 2-3 minutes for them, and they were asked to listen to it as if it were a story, and then after it they were asked to write down what they thought the story was about, without giving the chance to being given the chance to talk to others. And so we got the most wonderful stories out of the same sound poem about fights in the jungle, about crimes and roadside situations, strange religions, everything. And so we could make a very nice little book out of selection of the stories. So that, yeah, I can only judge this from my personal experience. It would be maybe it could be an interesting inquiry to ask people, do you have the urge to express yourself non-verbally, and when, and what's good about it, and what does it give you? And so, yeah.
Any more? I either didn't know or had forgotten that you had a background in mathematics. How far along did you get in mathematics? And
about 3/4. I got my baccalaureate, and then yeah, I could, if I would gone on, I could have probably finished in a year and a half or two or so. Yeah, but I was very much. I loved pure mathematics, and but I foresaw a rather lonely future working on. I was of the kind that could work on a problem until through the night, you know, and then when I had solved it, there was this black hole. What am I going to do now? So I don't know. It sort of felt sort of suffocating. But about so I quit around 1976, 77. But 20 years later, or 30 years later actually, I took a sabbatical, like off of performing a whole year, and I came back to it, and I learned computer programming languages, which I use a lot now for generating sound, for algorithmic composition, also for text generation and visuals. So it came back to me now that it was so much easier to use a computer. When I quit in the Institute of Mathematics of the Utrecht University, had this one computer, which was as big as a room, and so you had to make a reservation of half an hour of computer time and go there with your punch cards and feed them, and then these green printed sheets would come out after a while, and you could compute the first 100 prime numbers or so, something like that.
Okay, any more? Yep.
I'm currently reading Phantasmic Radio by Alan Weiss, and he talks about Antonin Artaud in his first chapter. And as Alan Weiss writes in To Be Done with the Judgment of God, Weiss proposes that the religious and magical use of glossolalia as catharsis, as a model of exorcism, and I see a similar liberation of the limitations of phonetics in your works. And I was wondering if you, following this model, what implications do you see of the expansion of the phonetic alphabet that you did, and the subsequent failure that the failure to control the expansion? It's a bit of a convoluted question.
Well, I have the experience. The more control you potentially have, the more you can also let it go, and it gives a structure in even when you are performing very intuitively, as is my experience. Some people say that knowing a lot about certain style of music would would spoil the enjoyment and enjoying of it. But I don't believe that. For me, it helps to to know about the structure and to have that background. So interesting that you mentioned that specific text of Artaud, because it's a repertoire piece of mine to have done with the Judgment of God. I was actually invited in 2010, it was I think by the BBC, to perform it at a festival here in London, and I went on with it, and I'm still performing it sometime in a quadraphonic version with electronics, and it's a great text and very impressive. And well, I insert more of the sound poetry of I think Artaud. I feel that where he inserted these fragments of meaningless words, it was at points when he could not express himself at that moment in regular language. So I insert them as well where I think it's needed to, well, clarify, intensify the situation at that moment in the text.
Thank you for that performance. It's really good. Thank you. Obviously, you do vocality pieces, and then you worked well with musicians. How was your approach when working with musicians with one of your pieces?
How my approach when I work with musicians?
Yeah, vocality. Yeah.
Oh, this can vary very strong. I do free improvisation still with musicians, but I also sometimes give them. I write traditional scores or give them certain instructions. Like one thing, I also performed this Prime Minister piece where the vowels are being dropped, and then there's a score where the musicians have to follow the text, and they have certain percussive sounds where the vowels were, and so you get a polyphonic percussive piece out of that phrase. That's one thing. Some things so like are text based, but there are many different ways, and playing along with a computer, and either that they know what's happening or they don't know, and there's some aleatoric, some chance operated sound going on, and they have to react to that, and so there's many ways.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Just along those lines, I was wondering, last night the performance you did with the percussionist and the double bass player, had you played with either of them before? Presumably you played with John before.
I didn't know the percussionist Bai Bai Wang, but I had played with John Edwards a long time ago. Yeah.
The percussionist, I'd never seen her before. She was brilliant.
It's very interesting.
Very interesting kind of response to your vocal work with her. Yeah. So Gareth, and then you.
Thank you for an amazing presentation. My question was actually very similar to the one that preceded. I was quite interested, just briefly, you talked about this idea of working with other, I think you said other vocalists, is that right?
I've worked with other vocalists, yeah.
Yeah, I just wondered also about what your experiences were, what your observations were of working within this framework polyphonically, and how that influences composition perhaps, how you start to think about harmonics and overtones, and generally the way that the sound could be layered.
For me, working with other vocalists is not that different from working with instrumentalists, actually. The only thing is that it can much easier go into a theatrical realm. Like if you have two people vocalizing, it can be any kind of contact between people, like a fight or whatever. So that's a difference. But other than that, I don't work very differently with vocalists than with instrumentalists, I must say. Of course, when I started out, I didn't know any improvising vocalists. That's why I was so uncertain of myself. Should it mean anything, this vocal improv? But then I got to know others later on, like David Moss, Phil Minton, of course, and Paul Dutton from Canada. And yeah, I performed with all of those, and there was some very rewarding experiences there. Yeah, I still have. There was a CD called Five Men Singing, which featured Paul Dutton, David Moss, Phil Minton, and Koichi Makigami from Japan, and a recording at the festival in Canada, which is yeah, one of the best experience in that field for me. Yeah.
If I could just ask one brief question. Are you at all influenced by singers who are sort of using extended technique?
Well, at first in a very negative way. I grew up in a very strict Reformed church, Calvinist family, where we had to go to church services that lasted 2 hours, and singing psalms and very slow, like one line, for instance, would go like Tijgend het de jacht ontkomen. Yeah, I'm not exaggerating. So it was the tempo where, as a young boy, you had to breathe 2 or 3 times to finish the line, and then the congregation was dragging half a bar after the organ, and so it was really terrible. And when I was 9 or 10 years old, I refused to sing anymore in church. But my mother was saying, "Yeah, but you should sing." But I don't want that. So I really grew up. I hated singing. And I think that's why I came back to the sound poetry with a love for consonants and not for vowels. Only later on, I started to enjoy singing. At first, when I knew classical music, I didn't want any vocal music, only instrumental. But it has changed, and now, since a few, the last 10 years or so, I'm also sometimes I've learned a lot of jazz ballads, and I'm singing them for myself, and so yeah.
Thank you.
You get you get a very strong emotional reaction from the audience, and I wondered, do you kind of feed off of that in the performance, and is there any kind of emotional narrative that you want to put forth when you're composing?
No, for me it's for instance, people think I have very strong emotions when performing, but it's actually only the joy of making sound. When for instance, I do this Prime Minister piece and I get to people have sometimes asked me, how can you get so angry every time you perform that piece? I'm not angry, I'm enjoying doing that, making those sounds, you know. And so also I know I make people laugh sometimes, but I don't really plan things to make them laugh like comedians do, and try things out, and if it works, and so I don't do that, and it's fine with me if they laugh. I think if there's humor in a performance, it counterbalances the aggressive or very sad sides that it can have as well, and they make them better bearable for people. So yeah, once I had. There was in a classical concert series in Amsterdam in the concert hall. There was an adventurous programmer who had made a subscription series about the sonata, and so I performed the Schwitters Ohr Sonata there, sandwiched between a Bach cello sonata and some other classical sonata. And I came on, and there was this typical like middle-aged concert audience people, and all these women taking out handkerchiefs, and they didn't dare to laugh, of course, because but they almost couldn't keep themselves from laughing.
Thank you.
I wondered, do you, I mean, people who sing for a living often worry about damaging their voices. Do you worry about damaging your throat?
I have never had any permanent damage. I know that's what people often think. Well, I have also had to learn how to use my voice. But I have had occasions where I was hoarse for a few days, but I now know what I can do, and especially how long I can do it. I can make many sounds that can damage your voice, but only if you do it in a short time. It doesn't hurt. Well, it hurts when you do, but it doesn't give any damage. Where I also learned some sounds that sound aggressive but are actually not damaging. For instance, this is a resonance that occurs at the top of the windpipe and not in the vocal cords so much, but the windpipe and also the esophagus, which is behind it. The top of that is resonating. This is an exercise that this singer from Tuva, from the throat singing culture, told me that is an exercise that young boys in their culture who are destined to be singers, to be shamans later on, they have to do it an hour every day to give them a strong low register when they grow up. And it's different from if you do that, you shouldn't do that too long. Also, you shouldn't do anything on the top of your volume for a long time. Many people, despite having a great technique, like good opera singers, have had problems with their voice because they had to sing too loud, too long over a massive orchestra, and so that is dangerous. Well, there's also inhaling sounds. When I started to do those, I had to cough after 20 seconds or so, but I worked on them, and one thing was sometimes by imitating a sound. During a certain period, I lived in Amsterdam at a spot where the tram came down from a bridge through a narrow band and made a squeaky sound. So I heard that sound every 5 minutes or so when I was living there, and I got into the habit of imitating it. But I could work on it and refine it a little bit. So making this tiny little high register inhaling that came actually from that habit of imitating that squeaky sound. Well, there are these sounds what I did in this piece, but that are just pressurized air. You do that all of a sudden, you cut off the blood vessels here and you can faint. But you feel it's coming, and so you can stop mostly in time. And it doesn't harm the vocal cords because they are not involved. It's just the air pressure there. Yeah.
Any last question? Okay, just one more, I think, and then we'll let you rest your voice.
I wonder, in what way did your practice change your own understanding of language when you, for example, speak or listen to somebody?
Well, it actually came in the beginning from the sound poetry texts that we have no recordings of, mostly. Well, later on, for the Schwitters, I discovered that there were some recordings, but I didn't know them at the time. So it came out of the nonsense language. And then in the improvisation, as I gave this example, inspired by free jazz instrumentalists who were able to make the most extraordinary sounds on their instrument, and I was doing that on the voice. But it happened very intuitively. Well, later on, for inspiration, I was getting myself some language courses of strange languages, like you have them in the early times. You had them with cassettes, or later with CDs, and listening to the sounds of those languages, not trying to learn the language, but just getting inspired by the sound, and also recordings of singing from different cultures around the world. Yeah, and then with the phonetic alphabet also writing some pieces. Where on several occasions I wrote a piece for myself in a notation with the intention of premiering it like a few days later, so only to discover I couldn't do it. There were the impossible transitions between phonemes that are very far from each other, and I just couldn't learn the piece, so that happened as well. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe I'll mention that I brought some recordings, CDs at I think a nice price of mostly £10 only. I have some cassettes also, that's a new hype, and still one copy of a vinyl record and some books. So if you're interested, I'm happy to try and give you some useful advice on what not to purchase.